tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So just jumping back into the flow that we were in before we paused last week for some counsel. Thank you for all of those who joined last week for this conversation about the current protests, what was happening in Minneapolis. It really felt helpful to my heart and seemed like to a bunch of folks to just really get real with the moment that we're in. And I'm going to just come right back into the stream of conversation that we were in, and that we've been in since the beginning of the year, looking at the foundations of the Buddha's insight and how it's come down to us. We started talking about the middle way, which is the first thing that he introduces in the beginning of the supposed or mythic first discourse, setting in motion the wheel of the Dhamma. And then we got on to just talking about the first two noble truths. And it's in this proposal that the whole of the path of the Dhamma in a way is contained, or out of which the whole of the path of the Dhamma grows. And this proposal is that things are painful for a reason. So the things are painful part is the first noble truth, right? This bhikkhus is the noble truth of dukkha, or pain, suffering, dissatisfaction, distress. Birth is painful, aging is painful, death is painful. Not getting what you want is painful. Getting what you didn't want is painful. So there's this mix in the definition of the First Noble Truth, in the definition of dukkha, that includes both, physical pain and emotional pain, grief and distress. The classical composite word, it's all one word in the Pali, or it's one big compound word, and it translates as, sorrow, grief, lamentation, pain, grief, and sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. Um, and the definition of dukkha, the first noble truth, is the definition of dukkha. It ends with the statement that the five grasping aggregates, or the five grasped aggregates, or the five aspects of experience are the thing that is painful. And so I'm not going to teach on the aggregates tonight. Many of you know that list: form, feeling, perceptions, formations, and consciousness. But the thing the Buddha wants us to get, I think, is that there's this experience of the painful that is both physical and mental, physical and emotional, and that the distressing aspect of this, the thing that's intolerable about this, is embedded in how we relate to our experience. And so the way it's phrased is, there is this noble truth, so this is the second noble truth, there is this noble truth of the cause of dukkha. And that cause is tanha, which literally means thirst. It usually gets translated as craving or grasping. And so there's something that happens, and I'm going to resist saying that there's something that we do. It is, in a way, something that we do. Grasping or craving, it's a kind of action. But think about the etymology of the word thirst, the word itself, tanha. You don't really do thirsty. You know, and, I mean, in contemporary slang, maybe you do thirsty, but like in its somatic experience, you're not doing the thing called being thirsty. It's organic, it's autonomic, it's really a response to conditions, and you're not really in control of it. When you're thirsty, you're thirsty. And so I think it's important that this is the metaphor or the word that the Buddha uses that we translate as grasping. Grasping feels like an action, you know. When I think, oh, I'm grasping, the hidden punchline to that is, yeah, well, stop, right? Like, well, stop grasping already. But but if I say I'm thirsty, then the response is drink some water, you know. So there's something different about grasping than just a thing that, you know, as a sort of post-Christian, I'm inclined to say like I want to call it a sin. I want to feel like when I'm grasping, I'm doing it wrong, you know. Just stop grasping already. And I think it's so compassionate and beautiful of the Buddha to recognize that it's not actually a thing that I'm doing on purpose. And maybe a way that we can think about this is that um, if grasping if grasping is autonomic, it's a response to something. So what's it a response to? And the place in the Buddha's teachings where we see a sequential teaching around what leads to what is in the cycle called Dependent Origination, Paticca Samuppada. And in Dependent Origination, grasping or tanha is one of the links. It's preceded by the link of sensory contact. So something is made contact with through the bodily senses or the mental sense. So you think of something, you touch something, you see it, hear it, smell it, taste it. And in response to that sensory experience, there can be, there isn't always, but there can be first um, a basic valence, a basic affective response that it is either pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. So I am a little thirsty right now. I take a sip of water and it is pleasant. It is instantly pleasant. I don't have to do something to understand that it's pleasant. Pleasant just hits my being in a kind of unconfusing sort of way, right? I'm not confused about whether it's pleasant or not. Sometimes, you know, sometimes the Vedana, the feeling tone, the affect, the valence is not clear, you know. This afternoon I was taking a break from one aspect of my work and watching, you know, short humorous videos on YouTube about a certain topic. Um, uh, I went down a rabbit hole on ethical philosophy at one point, and I was watching videos about about radical utilitarian Peter Singer, if you must know. Um, and but so I'm watching this video. I like Peter Singer. I liked the philosophy professor who was giving the little mini lecture. And but at some point I noticed that it was going on a bit long and I really should get back to work. And so I could notice in that moment, and I noticed in the memory of that moment, that it was both pleasant and unpleasant, or there were moments of pleasant, I like listening to this lecture, and unpleasant, I feel guilty that I'm, you know, taking too long of a break from work. Um, and also unpleasant that like I could be taking a different sort of nourishing break, like going outside and listening to the frogs, and instead I'm looking at YouTube, which is only sort of pleasant. So, you know, you get some kind of sensory hit. It's pleasant or unpleasant, or neither. So it could be quite neutral. If I wasn't as thirsty, for instance, the taste of the water might not give me such a strong pleasant hit, right? It might be more neither pleasant or nor unpleasant. It might be more neutral. As is, it's pleasant. So you have sensory contact. That's a link. That generally leads to this initial response of or reaction of Vedana, pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. And then Vedana can lead, and it does when there's no mindfulness, to grasping. So tanha or grasping is the next link. And just so you have the map, tanha or grasping is followed by upadana, which means feeding. So it's more active. I'm actually eating the thing. And upadana is often translated as clinging. And so even in the English words, you can notice that grasping or wanting, or craving, particularly, craving is almost a better response to it because it feels emotional, it feels energetic, it feels autonomic. You're not doing it as much as having it. So craving is followed by clinging, where craving or tanha is the kind of I can't help it response. Clinging is the like, I'm doing something about that. And I might still not be able to help it. Like I might still be in a kind of addictive state where I find myself, eating the unhealthy food or watching the unhealthy video or whatever before I even really know what I'm doing. Like mindfulness is offline. I'm just following impulse. Here I am doing something that, pleasure drew me there. And then, what am I doing? But clinging is when you're actually doing something about it. So with craving or grasping, I want something strongly. I want more of the pleasant, less of the unpleasant. With clinging, I'm trying to make that happen. So I'm reaching out for the substance. I'm, you know, uh, sending the text. I'm moving my body. I'm doing something to make something happen. And then um, clinging, upadana, is followed by being or becoming. The word is bhava. And it's kind of like the solidifying. Um, in language and some kinds of psychology, we would say like reifying. I really make something into a thing. You know. For our inner process and for really understanding dukkha, the important links to understand is that the valence we call Vedana, pleasant, unpleasant, or neither, follows upon contact. Grasping follows upon affect, and clinging follows upon grasping. And so there's a sequence from sensory contact that moves through a couple of levels of feeling, right? First, this basic affect into kind of grasping, which is sort of like a full-blown emotional response, right? There's a stronger, flavorful energy being directed towards something. And then clinging is a kind of solidification of that into action. One of the ways that neuroscientists right now think about the mind and what is happening when we're conscious, what's happening as we find ourselves to be self-aware beings with experiences. One of the models for the mind that's interesting right now is that the mind is a kind of predictive processor where it takes in this sensory information from the world that is in a lot of ways unordered. Like pure sensory data is pretty chaotic. It's light and color and shape and line. Um, but we learn, very early in our life that certain patterns most likely are certain things, right? And so then we learn to recognize things. So when I see a certain shape, you know, like if you could ask a newborn infant what a certain shape is that has a long brown thing at the center and lots of green fluffy stuff off the edge, it doesn't have a word for that and it doesn't really have a concept for that. But, it learns soon enough that you can use the word tree for that. And the more times the recognition is affirmed by the environment, so confirmed as accurate, you know, infant, infant toddler says twee, and mama says twee, you know, all of those ways that we learn language, we learn concepts together, the prediction mechanism gets refined, right? The system learns, oh, when I see that shape, it's most likely a tree. There's always a tiny doubt that it's not a tree, right? It never becomes absolute certainty. Is it cake? Right. You know, could be cake, doesn't look like cake, right? For the tree example, think about like, you're driving down some country highway and your mind, without you noticing anything about it, is like tree, 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 tree. And then at some point, your mind goes, tree? Right? The prediction mechanism got jangled by something. It pulls your attention because we really don't like not knowing what things are because it could be dangerous. And your brain goes, tree, not tree. Cell phone tower, disguised as tree. Aha, you know, and then recognition sort of reforms. And probably the first half dozen times you saw those things, your brain was like, eh? And after several times, right, the prediction has come true a number of times. And so then, it doesn't set off alarm bells as much. It's just like, cell phone tower, and then pretty soon it drops out of conscious noticing if it becomes common. And so we do this with, recognizing other people, recognizing situations. Some folks are very skilled at this and, learn to recognize, for instance, subtle emotions in another person's face. Others of us are not skilled at that and don't learn that very easily. Um, it's true uh, that in a sense, we're talking about pattern recognition and how we relate to the patterns we recognize. I happen to have pattern recognition, not very skilled with faces, but very skilled with sounds. And so I'm the sort of musician that can hear a song and then sit down at the piano and approximately play it decently, unless it's really weird, you know? Um, so, like I can do it for the Beatles, but I can't do it for Radiohead, that kind of thing. But, I'm somewhere in there. And um, and I can tell that what I'm doing is, as I'm hearing things, there's this constant like, what is it? Categorization and sort of, you know, organizing of it behind the scenes. So I want to propose that there's a way that the sequence of sensory experience moving through affect, which in a way is like affect is sort of like a filter that says what should I really pay attention to or not, because most things that are neither pleasant nor unpleasant, I just don't notice. And so it's only the things that really stand out as pleasant or unpleasant that attention is drawn toward. That's really a nervous system. It's a protective mechanism in the nervous system. It's part of what the attention is trained to do for this exact same reason, right? As I was growing up, I would get into these situations where something is startling and it might be dangerous, So like when I hear the squealing of car tires, my attention is drawn there because I've learned every time I hear squealing car tires, something is happening that I might want to pay attention to, right? I want to know where it's coming from, what direction it's going, all of that. When I hear someone or feel the energy of someone with a kind of angry or a certain tone of angry in their body language, verbal language, whatever it is, fashion style, like this is also how like racial bias is developed, all of these things, right? We learn messages about things, whether they're true or not, kind or not, accurate or not, we learn them. Um, you learn what to pay attention to. And so I'm going to propose that this system is what's happening when we go contact, Vedana or affect, craving, clinging. That there's and then becoming. Becoming is like the idea or the experience has fully reified. It is fully solidified in my attention. And so the path toward an experience and my interpretation of that experience solidifying is this pathway that goes from bare sensory data into what should I pay attention to, into what do I feel about this thing that I'm now paying attention to, and what should I do about that? And then if you really take it to bhava, it's like, and who am I in relation to that? Right? So that's this whole middle section of dependent origination. There's sensory contact, Then there's a valence reaction. What's going on here, and should I pay attention to it? It's pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. Pleasant and unpleasant, if they're strong enough, I should pay attention to them, right? That's what they call out to me. So then my attention goes to it. If it's pleasant, it goes to it, and I'm habituated to want more of that, right? If it's unpleasant, my attention goes to it. I'm habituated to want less of it, push away, protect myself from it. And so based in that initial hit of Vedana, the response of craving generally arises. Based in craving, I'm having a strong feeling. One of the things that feelings are is they're the seeds of action. They're the things that tell us how to act, what to do, if to act. And so, one thinker, I can't remember who said this, said, think about actions as the output of an algorithm. And the algorithm is like, what's happening? So prediction based, scan your senses, map the world around you. And the output of that mapping is a feeling. And the feeling is something like, I like it, I want more of it. I don't like it, I want less of it. What should I do about that? And the whole process that leads to action, that information passes through the sensory and then emotional channels. And emotional here doesn't just mean like the big, emotion-y emotions like anger, sadness, grief, anxiety, etc. Um, it's also just a way of talking about the territory between the raw affect, like just that very organic hit of liking or not liking, a pleasant, unpleasant, leading to liking or not liking. The territory between that and action is that seed, if it's just pleasant, that doesn't really have an action seed in it. And we've grown into habits where if something is pleasant, there's very, very well-worn pathways for how we assume that's supposed to, become action. But it doesn't need to. And one of the things that was so core that in the Buddha's insight is that a huge number of the things that we habituate in terms of actions arising from pleasant stimulus are actually optional, right? You only really need a certain amount of food and a certain amount of nutritious food. And everything beyond that is kind of entertainment, right? You only need a certain amount of clothing to protect yourself from the elements and the bugs. Everything beyond that is basically entertainment, right? You only need a relatively simple shelter from the elements, and everything beyond that is kind of entertainment, right? And likewise medicine. So the four requisites: food, clothing, shelter, medicine. Those are the four things that monastics need to be given. That's the four things that you basically need to stay alive in a body, in an ecosystem. And the Buddha was like, what you need of those things, we talked about this when we were talking the middle way a couple weeks ago, is relatively simple, not that much, and so he was like, okay, so if we simplify it that much, what then might we understand about this process where dissatisfaction, dukkha, arises as a result of grasping, right? What do you understand about pain? When you look at the origin of pain or distress really being this like metastasized affect. It was pleasant, but I'm not able to just rest with the simple pleasantness of the thing. I really want to do something about that, And so the mind has gone from affect to feeling into action, into identity in a way. And each of those layers is a way that the map that I have around me right? My predictions have solidified not just into how do I feel about this, but what should I do about this? And those actions, what should I do about this? Um, I practice them over and over and over, right? I practice, clinging, the action of trying to get what I want over and over and over, you know, um, so that I can consistently have the experience of the thing I want, you know. I work X amount hard to be able to pay this much rent, to be able to have this much house around me, and um, I've settled into my desires at this point in my adult life, right? I've settled into my desires with such a consistency that I don't notice the process of, sensing, feeling, reacting, and and acting on those reactions. I don't notice it. I just do it all day, every day, you know. Um, and so the Buddha proposes, is partly why the monastic system came first in Buddhism. The first thing that he proposed was strip a ton of that away. So you're living very, very simply. And now see what happens if you slow down into perceiving with so much precision the way that pleasant and unpleasant leads to wanting, leads to doing things, right? And leads to a kind of solid sense of yourself. And of course, dependent origination goes on, and we can talk about this some other time. Dependent origination goes on into saying, bhava, becoming, is followed by birth, which is both like taking birth as this one here, like I got myself all comfortable and now I am this, I am this, you know. But of course it also means taking rebirth into your next birth, right? If I've really solidified this thing in myself where I need certain things to be a certain way, that's basically I'm intending to keep acting. I'm intending to keep doing things in the world to stay comfortable, to try to keep things being the way I want. And that's just a recipe for sticking around, Continue participating because you want more. You still want this or a better version of this. And so we can see this process of the second noble truth, the cause of dukkha, leading to the first noble truth, the experience of dukkha, as a kind of map for how the sense of self, the sense of solidity of myself and others and the world around me is generated from bare sensory information. And the way that it comes into this solidity is through the emotional process of identifying things, mapping them. And part of the map includes my relationship to them and my feelings about them. So because I'm not just mapping tree, person, book. I'm mapping tree that I like, person that I'm scared of, book that I want to buy, whatever, all the things, right? Everything comes with its Vedana. Everything comes with a reaction, right? So um, there's not a neutral world out there independent of my senses. There's not actually a sound being made by a tree that falls in the forest that no one hears. First of all, someone always hears because humans are not the only people listening. So there's always somebody in the forest listening. Trees make sounds. But abstractly in the mental puzzle of it, if I think that there's a tree out there totally separate from me, independent from me, no relation to me whatsoever, th- um, that thought, that concept doesn't make sense because everything that I even understand about what a tree is not just a neutral map of the world around me, but it's a map that includes myself. and including myself means includes my reactivities and my patterns and my culture, all the things that I've learned about trees, and people and everything else. And so the map always includes us. And here's just a seed for later. One of the things that we might, one of the places this might unfold as or blossom as, the seed of this teaching, is that if we recognize that the map that we carry of the world is based in grasping, it's based in our reactivity to things, and that it is that grasping that creates the sense of myself in the map. That when I stop grasping, I also release the sense of myself as an isolated point of reference in the map. If I stop grasping, I actually drop back through that sequence of, oh, less clinging, less grasping. There's just the bare affect of things being pleasant and unpleasant. And when I'm doing that, it's not that I'm suddenly happy and free as an independent being in the universe. It's that the felt sense concept of my being an independent being in the universe that's in all these, fractal-like relationships with everything else colored by feeling, that falls away. Because the only thing connecting all of us is this kind of reactive mapping quality. That falls away. And that's not that that's the only thing connecting all of us. We're connected in a whole nother way. The main habitual way that I feel my connection with things is through the grasping function. If I see through the grasping function, part of what I do is I see through the predictive aspects of the map, and I learn to rest in a much more bare or uninterpreted layer of sensory experience. In a way, this is what meditative jhana or insight states can be like, is sensory experience without interpretation or as much interpretation, further down on the predictive layer. And as you go down the predictive layers, you're also going to go down the grasping layers because they're actually in parallel with each other. You're taking apart the story that you've unconsciously been trained to hold about yourself and the world. Right? And at base, there can be this resting, essentially hovering between affect and grasping. So without grasping, without giving rise to the emotional reactivity of clinging, experience can be quite direct. There's sensory experience, and it's naturally pleasant or unpleasant, and even that can get a little soft in some meditative states, right? And so then in mindfulness we say, oh, there's just the knowing, actually, and you can train in this. We train in this all the time. This is this training. This is what's happening, and that's it. And I just train. I keep coming back to that again and again. This is what's happening. And it's like I'm trying to see the thing before the story. And the last thing I'll say about this is that with my kid and our little family, particularly through the rainy winter, we did a lot of puzzles this year. My kid is 10. It's a good time for more complicated puzzles to arise. And we've been getting into puzzles that aren't just sort of cartoon drawings of things, but that are actually like, the current one is a couple of cardinals on a birch tree. And birch trees, it's just kind of a bunch of white and gray splotches. And a lot of the painting is that. It's a very hard puzzle. It's lovely. And one of the things I notice is when I'm doing it um, is I'm looking at the pieces and I can notice the moment when my attention shifts away from, I'm looking for a leaf over white birch bark, and it shifts into, oh, I'm looking for a splotch of gray on a splotch of white with a little bit of, blue at the end of a spade-like arm of the piece shape, right? I've dropped down a narrative level. I'm not looking for a leaf on a tree anymore. That's a story. I'm looking for a blob of gray on a blob of white. And so, and I notice that when I do that, my whole visual field shifts and my sensory relationship to the visual field shifts, or my cognitive relationship, I think, to the sensory field shifts. And this is very much like what will happen on long retreat, where you're just seeing and you start to drop away from the the pattern recognition overlay that's so naturally there. And you can do it right now, right? Instead of seeing people on the screen, just almost like back up just a little, and you can see like glowing rectangles with colors and lines. And and it's just the tiniest little shift, right? But you've dropped down a kind of cognitive layer, sort of into the pre-narrative sensory layer. And as you do that, your sense of grasping at whatever you're grasping will change, right? And so then this is our practice. We practice doing this, dropping into a simpler sensory field, or a lower down sensory field, not because we want to live there permanently, but because it actually teaches us something about dukkha, right? About how we land in suffering so often. All right, we'll pause there for now. Gratitude to your mindful, kind attention for letting itself be drawn in this direction for this half hour.